So let's get started. I want to welcome everyone to the first of 3 Darling Marine Center Summer Science Talks. And I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Bob Steneck. Bob is faculty in our School of Marine Sciences and also in residence at the Darling Marine Center, and has been conducting research in Maine and around the world on marine ecosystems for quite a while, and was recently recognized for his accomplishments and achievements with one of University of Maine's highest honors, the Presidential Research and Creative Achievements Award. So congratulations for that, Bob. And without further ado, I'll turn things over to you. Bob's going to speak for about 25 minutes, and then we'll have some active Q&A. You can put your questions in the chat, and I will read those questions and share them with Bob after his remarks. Welcome, Bob.
Great. Thank you, Heather, and welcome everyone. This is the first time I've ever given a seminar from my kitchen. So I think I'll get started with this to give you an idea of let's see if I get the right thing here. Share, hold on one second. And okay, so my talk today is focused on some of the indirect factors that relate to our lobster fishery in terms of climate change. Everybody knows something about climate change, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with some stuff that you may already know, or maybe you don't know, review a few things I've learned over the last 40 years or so, and describe, I think, a big and possibly important indirect effect of climate change. This is not the kind of thing that's been on a lot of people's radar, but also changes that have gone on in the lobster's ecosystem. And really some thoughts on what this might mean, and really give you an idea of what's next in our research. You know, the thing about scientific research, it's about understanding the context of a problem and then how you might solve the problem. And I'd like to end this with exactly where we are and exactly what we're measuring and why. So the American lobster, it's also called the Maine lobster. I have to remind myself of that. You know, where to start? Well, there's a couple things that you may or may not know about the lobster. It's one of the largest mobile benthic invertebrates in the world. The world record of the Maine lobster is a little bit under 50 pounds. The one I'm holding there, you can see is big. Its claws much bigger than my hand. I also show this as I think the worst photograph ever taken of me. But the other thing that people don't realize is that lobsters, the clawed lobster, our Maine lobster, is not at all related to spiny lobsters. As a matter of fact, its closest relative are freshwater crayfish. The lobster, the Maine lobster, can live to be 100 years old, or at least estimated to be that big. Some years it makes up nearly 80% of all marine resource value in the state of Maine. So you get a sense of its obvious importance here. In fact, it's the single most valuable species to the fisheries of North America. So it's impressive. Lobster populations in Maine, those densities are, as far as I can tell, the highest population density of any lobster in the world, whether spiny or clawed lobster. The Maine lobster fishery is the only fishery in the world to have been actively fished for over 150 years, but recent landings are the greatest ever. And so that's all good news. But there's also some bad things that have happened to this really good fishery. And I think it's worth pointing out a few of these bad things, and they're not actually going to be things that I'm going to talk more about, but they're for every lobsterman who's working on the coast of Maine or in the region knows about these things. Herring bait is getting scarce and it's expensive. Bait is shipped to Maine from as far away as New Zealand to support our lobster fishery. Northern right whales occasionally get entangled by fishing gear, actually very rarely in Maine gear, but as an endangered species, lobster fishing has to minimize any chance of entanglement. And this has been a huge problem that the lobster industry and state and federal managers have been working on for actually years now. Lobster is a great product for socializing, for restaurants. 30% of all of Maine's harvested lobsters go to cruise ships, and all of those factors are more reduced in terms of demand because of the pandemic. And this is a very, very hard time. As a matter of fact, I'm going to put in a pitch right now for anybody living in Maine. Get local lobsters for dinner. You know, it's cheaper than most of the other fish that you can get these days. But today's talk is going to focus on really the changing, you know, these indirect changes in the climate, but within a changing marine ecosystem. And that's really important. I think everybody knows that our planet is getting warmer. This is an image of the world. The darker red colors are the warmer, you know, the unusually warm temperatures. And you'll notice that they're concentrated at the poles, particularly the North Pole. I think you all heard Siberia broke 100 degrees recently, first time ever. And the Gulf of Maine is right in that corner. So we have one of the warmest warming bodies of water in the world. Locally, Boothbay Harbor has been, what is now Department of Marine Resources, have been following sea surface temperatures since 1906. And the trend is pretty obvious. Boothbay Harbor and every place else is getting warmer. And why that matters is that water temperatures are really important for settling lobsters. The baby lobsters are what sets the population density of lobsters on the seafloor. And work done at the Darling Center by Americanus, who got his PhD at the University of Maine, showed that actually if the water temperature was colder than 2 degrees, roughly 54 degrees Fahrenheit, it was really too cold. The lobsters wouldn't settle down to the seafloor, so they wouldn't get started. As a matter of fact, we would call that 12 degree the thermal threshold. Then up to about 18 degrees where it starts getting too warm. And that temperature between 12 and 18 degrees, that's kind of this sweet spot where you're getting the most babies going to the seafloor. And of course, that means not only does the water temperature have to be warm enough at the surface, but as they're going down, if they hit cold water, they'll come back up. So bottom temperatures matter as well. So some years ago, I actually suggested this idea in terms of if you think about lobsters settling in colder regions like eastern Maine or colder years, there's going to be a very narrow band that's within that sweet spot, that thermal threshold. But in warmer regions or warmer years, that's going to expand. And a very recent paper, it just came out, I just saw it this month, talks about trends and change points in the surface and bottom temperatures, which I really like that they're doing bottom temperatures. Several people from the University of Maine, Andrew Good and Damien Brady, are involved in this project. But here's the bottom line. If you just look at the surface, and this is basically what you'd see in the summertime, it was relatively flat from 1968 to 2000, and that's well within this lobster sweet spot. But then you see it jumping up. And what's interesting in this paper is that they're actually jumping in steps. But nevertheless, the surface temperature all within, you know, that 12 to 18 degree range. What's interesting is if you look at bottom temperatures, it's holding pretty constant. But it's actually below that temperature that you need for settlement. And then it jumps up into that sweet spot about 2008. And that's a really interesting new fact for me anyway. So that's an interesting point, that we look at the trend of increasing temperature, and it's not exactly linear. But if you look overall, Maine's DMR has been doing a ventless trap survey since the mid-2000s. And in shallow water, what they see is it increased somewhat around 2010, after 2008, basically, but it's leveled off. Whereas in deeper and deeper water, it's actually going up. And this would be consistent with deeper water settlement of these baby lobsters. So when you look at a satellite image in the summertime of the Gulf of Maine, the blue areas are the cooler regions with what we call the eastern Maine coastal current. And then those warmer areas down towards Cape Cod, that's the western Maine coastal current. You're going along the coast from the south west to the northeast, and it gets colder. But it was perhaps too cool, but it is warming. And the main sweet spot, now is someplace in between these areas. Well, in a paper that graduate student Andrew Good and others published on the brighter side of climate change, we figured, well, that's a title people don't hear very often. It's about how this oceanography actually affects the lobster boom. How much do lobster nursery habitats expand? And so what we ended up doing was we modeled, if you go from a cold year to a warm year, how much of an expansion do you see? And in Western Maine, that 2004 was a cool year, and you see the red is very modest, whereas 2012, it's expanded. That's the expansion of the nursery habitats. That's cool, so to speak. But in 2004, that expansion that was very cold, compared to the warm year 2012, you see a much, much greater expansion. And that's really important because the rising lobster landings in Maine are heavily driven by the changes that are going on in eastern Maine. If you look at what we see, the western regions have been increasing, but increasing at a relatively slow, low slope. Whereas eastern Maine, including Washington and Hancock County, that's really going up in a really dramatic way. And notice that there is an inflection point right around 2008. Now, if there's a jump up in temperature, the first thing you'll notice is increased trappability, but also there's a potential over time for increased deep water settlement of lobsters. So there are these dynamics going on, and a lot of what we can do with satellites and with oceanography and with traps is you get a certain idea of lobster distribution abundance, but all metrics of abundance have limitations. So why don't we just count them? Well, this is what I did when I first came here to the University of Maine. It took me a good 9 years or so studying lobster before I figured out how to count them, where to count them, how to develop good census techniques. And then I gathered up a group of people. Immediately next to me is Rick Wally, who somehow hasn't aged since 1989. I don't know why that's that way. But we repeated these surveys in locations every year. And we had tons of interns and graduate students working on this for a full decade. Our last one of that series was in 1999. And so we had a number of sites that we looked at over throughout the coast of Maine. 4 major areas, York, Pemaquid, Mount Desert, and Jonesport, were the areas that I used as my sentinel sites for monitoring. In 1989, the population distribution across this region shows a very strong maximum abundance around York Harbor, tailing off. 10 years later, we saw that movement of the abundance was now moving to the east. So the sweet spot is moving east, and we have every reason to believe it's still moving east. But what I was seeing in the 1990s was a lot of that pink stuff that you see is calcareous algae. We saw sea urchins. Lobsters are living in shelters. They like to live in shelters. They live inside boulder shelters. So areas that had complex bottoms were where we found the highest population densities. When we did experiments, we put down PVC pipes. The lobsters readily got in them. So we have this paradigm that suggests that you start with reproduction, and the little larvae that are swimming around, they are thermally mediated into those temperatures, 12 to 18 degrees. They settle to the seafloor into cobblestone habitats where they're safe from little predators. That's kind of a demographic bottleneck. Rick Wally and I published that years ago. And as they grow, they move into boulder fields, and that's where they concentrate. This was the paradigm through the 1990s. And then the larger lobsters may be found more abundantly offshore, where they're a little bit more indifferent about substrate. But the point is, at that time, most landings were from shelter-providing habitats such as boulder fields. So the question might be, really, why do they live in shelters? And I think all you have to do is look at the size of fish being caught at Monhegan in 1880, and you get a pretty good idea. The coast of Maine and throughout the North Atlantic was dominated by large predatory fishes. And I've talked about this before and published a number of papers on it. These were major predators. But if you just look at the changes in cod, for example, the largest of our predators out there, and you look at all the National Marine Fisheries Service trawl data, you end up seeing a pattern that has been changing over time. In the 1970s, we had a pretty complete sort of donut around the Gulf of Maine. Coast of Maine had abundant cod. By the 1980s, this was breaking up, presumably due to fishing. By the 1990s, it was breaking up even more. And by the 2000s, what we're dealing with really is the coast of Maine being largely depleted of cod and most large predatory fish. Cod is a pretty good one to follow, but if you did wolffish or haddock, it would pretty much show the same pattern. So what? Well, the big so what is that this is an ecosystem that's fundamentally changed in favor of the lobster. And that, has to be considered good news for everybody who likes lobsters. But it suggests that the food web is fundamentally changed, that the top predators, the cod, that used to have a controlling influence on their prey, and their prey, let's just say, for keep it simple, included sea urchins, lobsters, and crabs. All of those were probably suppressed way back when cod were super abundant. In Maine, we actually only have one herbivore on our seafloor, and I'll show you why that's important. Because when when the herbivores were controlled by carnivores, seaweed was probably relatively abundant. But with overfishing of these predators, some of these prey, all the prey increased in abundance. We had good data on that. But I wanted to focus on this herbivore because that was really abundant back in the day when I got started here. The value of, sorry, didn't mean for that. Anyway, a point is that we had carpets of sea urchins, and this did not go unnoticed by the fishing industry. In 1987, an industry began, the product was shipped to Japan. By 1993, the value of the sea urchin fishery was second only to the value of the lobster fishery. There were 1,600 full-time sea urchin fishermen back then. And it's a classic boom and a bust. Today, sea urchins are extraordinarily rare. But I tell you this because of the impact sea urchins have on the coast of Maine. There is a bigger implication. This is footage I took at Pemaquid Point. This is a Boulder Field. Lobsters would love Boulder Fields like this. There's coralline, calcareous algae, there's sea urchins. This is 1993. 2 years later, in exactly the same location, it looked like this. It got overgrown by kelp. It was a kelp forest that sprung up virtually overnight. And kelp is actually a pretty good habitat for lobsters, but over time, we started seeing this carpet of finer algae starting to spread. And it's spreading because we don't have any herbivores. And that's not the only story. But to get us caught up, I wanted to introduce you to our team from last year. Because we went back, we wanted to go back to all the same sites and see how's the ecosystem changed, and really how has the lobster population changed. So Robert Jarrett, my graduate student, along with interns of Grace McDermott, Beth Davis, and Stella Moreno, we set out, by the way, we're posing in front of a submarine. We spent a week using a submarine, but really everything I'm going to talk about is our scuba diving. So let's go back to what we found in the 1990s. If we go from York, which is near the New Hampshire border on the left, over to Jonesport, which is getting closer to Canada on the right, we see that there is a big abundance of lobsters in the mid-coast of Maine. And then we go back to those places, and let's compare our results that we found in 2019 with those other studies that we did. All these are in boulder habitats where lobsters were concentrated in 2019. So this is what we found in 2019, in 1999 and to 1989, that decade. And this is what we found in 2019. Immediately, I was shocked by how much lower population densities were, at least in some of the locations. But looking at the data more closely, a more interesting pattern showed up. If we look at the substrates in which lobsters were found, realize that we are sampling boulders, ledge, and sediment habitats. And what we saw was the boulder habitats showed this marked decline. So lobsters were not living in the shelters where they traditionally used to be concentrated. And in the featureless bottoms, ledge and in sediment substrates, they're concentrating. Another way of looking at this analytically is just looking at a variance to mean ratio where if it comes out at the higher values, that means they're aggregated. That means the lobsters are clustered around a boulder field. And if they fall below that line, they're increasingly random or spread out. Well, why has this change occurred, and what's different about since the late 1990s? And I think this difference in the habitat architecture due to the seaweed is a very big factor. Those are all pictures taken between 1975 and the 1990s. And these are all pictures. The first one was when everything shifted over to kelp, but then we started seeing these carpets move in. On top of that, we have this warming temperature, and the warming temperature does a number of things. Warmer seawater holds less oxygen. It also actually allows more species from other habitats to invade. But let's just think about this low oxygen for a second. Okay, this is a map. The bottom picture is a map of the Damariscotta River turned on its side. So north is to the right. Damariscotta Newcastle is right over here, and then you see the Darling Center is kind of in the middle, and the outer coast is on the left. Okay, Pemaquid Point that I showed you before is in this image. Damian Brady has been conducting oceanographic work looking at oxygen saturation along this gradient, and what he has found is that this outer coastal region, especially at depth, actually has lower levels of oxygen. When it gets too low, it's called hypoxia. And this is happening on our coast right now. So we're starting in the summertime having relatively low oxygen. And then warmer temperatures has allowed the invasion of what the lobstermen call gorilla hair. It's got a scientific name I won't bore you with, but the warmer temperatures allow the gorilla hair to come in. It's really creating carpets. It's clogging up the shelter space. And it may be making boulder habitats inhospitable. Now, if the lobsters are not in boulders these days, that's not such a problem since there aren't any predators. But what you can see on the seafloor today are just lots. I say tons of rotting seaweed. No, I haven't measured tons, but a lot of rotting seaweed. And if that is going to shelters, and we are finding it in the shelters, this could be creating hypoxia, which would be a good reason for lobsters to avoid going in shelters, which is exactly the pattern that we're seeing. When you look at the distribution of different habitats, you can use side scan sonar, and you can map ledge and sediment and boulder fields, and you can actually quantify the amounts. This happens to be around Dameron Island in the mid-coast of Maine. But if you look at the proportion of these different substrates as a function of depth, this is some of Carl Wilson's master's thesis, what you end up seeing is ledge and sediment makes up most of the bottom. And boulders, which is this lower line down here, doesn't make up that much habitat. They were concentrating that, but now they're spread out. Well, that's really interesting, and that's really different because of this much greater ledge and sediment. So let's think about it this way. If you drop a lobster trap down, it has a range of attraction. That's the blue circle. And if the lobsters, which are the black dots in this upper left-hand figure, if the black dots are lobsters and they're concentrated in boulder habitats, well, the trap attraction in this cartoon would be about 7 lobsters. But if they're spread out, as our data suggests that they are, that same trap would only be attracting about 3 lobsters within that range of attraction. Now, do we know this is happening? No. This is the kind of hypothesis that a scientist would advance to then start studying this in a variety of ways, which is exactly the kind of research that we are poised to do as we go through the hoops of learning how to do research in a pandemic environment. But my point is, we see a pattern. We suggest a couple of patterns here. We suggest that this could affect the distribution. This could have big consequences. The big consequences would include, this is the pattern in terms of pounds, the gray bars, of lobster landings since 1950. And you'll notice that the highest point up here is 2016. But since 2016, there's been a decline. And it's possible that there's just simply fewer lobsters. It's also possible that given that there's a fixed number of traps, but the lobsters are more spread out, that in fact, it could be that much of this decline could simply be lobsters spreading out, causing a lower catch rate. Do we know that's the case? No, this is simply a hypothesis. It's something that I'm like giving this talk because I'm going to try to test this. I hope more people will try to examine this as a possibility for what might be going on with this decline in lobster landings. So what we're left with is a really interesting ecosystem dynamic. As I pointed out, we look at the patterns over time first. And what I suggested is we went from an ecosystem dominated by fish to one that had a lot of sea urchins until it shifted over to seaweed dominance of various sorts. At the same time, we're seeing accelerated ocean warming. Lobsters had to live in shelters or they'd be lunch for cod. They were shelter preferring when I was studying them in the 80s and 90s, but now they seem to be avoiding shelters. The ecological processes driven by fisheries to a degree, if you look at this left, when ground fish are taken out and sea urchins are able to do well, they could graze down. But when the sea urchin fishery began, that reduced the number of grazers. Kelp and other small canopy algae took off. This created a world with lots of crabs and actually relatively possibly a change in habitat for lobsters. So their shelter suitability goes from one that was lobster-friendly shelters on the left to where hypoxia caused lobsters to avoid shelters. So from all of this, what I'm getting at is that there are challenges in this changing ecosystem. These changes are subtle, but they're important. The Gulf of Maine ecosystem clearly is changing. Lobster abundance has increased due to ocean warming by expanding nursery habitats and also due to the fisheries-induced predator loss. Ocean warming also allowed non-native algae to proliferate, and the combination of warmer temperatures, rotting seaweed may be making shelters hostile to lobsters due to low oxygen. Stay tuned because this is an indirect effect of climate change and is the research we're currently studying. So, what do lobster futures look like? Who knows? But thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. That was a fantastic overview of a really complex and dynamic system. We have at least 3 questions in the Q&A. I invite people to continue to add questions to the Q&A, and we'll address as many as we can in the next 20 minutes or so. The first comes from Molly Spencer. I think, Bob, you can probably see these under Q&A, but I'll read them aloud in case that's easier for some folks. Molly asks from Bigelow Lab, I'm doing research on zooplankton abundance in shallow coastal Maine. What do you think the implications are for the diet of larval lobsters that tend to settle in shallow and warmer waters? Is their diet sustainable?
That is a really good question, and I'm really excited about the research you're doing. I know this is something that Rick Wally and others down in Connecticut have been looking into. What we do know from a number of studies, including Jeff Runge's work, that as sea temperatures get warmer, zooplankton populations are shifting and changing in very major ways. I know he's been focused on Calanus spinmarticus, a very big deep water zooplankton. Look, it's entirely possible that the zooplankton is being affected by this, and I believe it's the entrainment of the nuclear power plant down in New Hampshire, where the empirical data suggests that first stage lobsters, recently hatched lobsters, are relatively abundant, but the fourth stagers are relatively rare, and one possibility is starvation. And I'm hoping people are looking into metrics of nutrition. Other people, including Rick, are looking at this deep water settlement hypothesis, and he is finding a deeper water settlement. So I certainly did not intend for what I'm suggesting to be the only story here, and there may be many moving parts of this ecosystem.
Thank you. Another question comes from Alex Asher at the University of Maine. Could a range of trap attraction be increased in this more open environment? That is, Boulder is a more sheltered habitat compared to ledge. lobsters may find a trap more attractive in more open habitat?
Actually, that's a very good point. And a scientist at Department of DFO, Department of Fisheries and Oceanography in Canada, Bob Miller is his name. He actually looked at this, and he actually did model the attraction radius increases on featureless areas. So you're quite right about that. The question is going to be one of scaling, because if you look at the difference in terms of the vast areas of sediment and ledge compared to the relatively small and concentrated for Boulder, and given the fact that number of lobster traps fished on the coast of Maine has been regulated and reducing since 1995, I'm guessing, and we could talk about this more at the Darling Center when we're both there with our masks on, it's a question of how much the scale of the attraction expands relative to the expansion, potential expansion of the lobster population. And what Robert, Jarrett, and I are hopefully doing this summer is doing remotely operated vehicle work to look at the range of distribution and whether what the actual population densities are on these expansive areas, because it's possible we're only looking at abundant lobsters immediately adjacent to Boulder Field. So it might be an over-representation, but good point, Alex.
And here's a question from Rick Wally. Damien's map of oxygen in the Damascotta River is interesting, but shows percent saturation, not absolute concentrations. So if temperatures are cooler on the outer coast in the summer, and we know oxygen saturation concentration increases at lower temperatures, the absolute oxygen concentration could in fact be higher on the outer coast than upriver. Do you have a map of absolute concentration?
Well, I'm sure Damien does, but I really think that the saturation level is actually going to give you an idea of what's biologically available. And as we go into lower saturation levels, I mean, it's true that even offshore, the water temperatures are cooler. So in fact, you would anticipate, all things being equal, the saturation level being actually higher, but it's lower for interesting, and we don't entirely understand the relationship of benthic and other respiration as it's sucking oxygen out of the water column. But just simply put, I mean, and often for people who aren't scientists, I say, if you want to get an idea of how well a liquid holds a gas, just put a nice cold Coca-Cola on the dashboard of your car and park it in an open parking lot in the summertime. When you open it up, I guarantee you all that gas is going to come out very rapidly. So it's just the capacity of water to hold oxygen, and it's really compromised at warmer temperatures, but it's also compromised by biological oxygen demand, the BOD. But we can talk about that too, since your office is right across from mine when we have our masks on.
So another question comes from Robin Haddock Seeley. The intertidal zone is shifting shoreward. How does that affect lobsters in the shallow subtidal, which must also be shifting?
Right. Well, it looks like if there's a shift, it's a shift in the other direction to deeper water. But you're quite right, Robin, about as we have sea level go up, you might anticipate having some settlement into newly bared areas. I know that Diane Cowan for years has monitored newly settled lobsters in the intertidal zone. They're not as abundant as they are subtidally because of the stresses, but they're certainly there. But I'd have to say, from last year's work that we did, the shallow water population densities in the shelter providing substrates overall seem to be lower than what we saw in the past, and including in cobblestone habitats. Some of this rotting seaweed, I can remember before we had so much seaweed on the seafloor, when I would lift up cobblestones, the sediment was just white, clean sediment. Now when I do that, it's black and it's got all the appearance of sulfur fixing bacteria because it's sitting underneath a rock, creating, I think, micro habitats where oxygen is low. So we actually just got a grant to an oxygen probe. We're chomping on the bit to start probing some of these areas to see what the oxygen levels are. There's no reason not to try to do that into the intertidal zone, where I know you work with your beloved ascophyllum.
So that addresses Chris Davis's question as well. He was asking about dissolved oxygen measurements in the rotting seaweed. It sounds like that's something you're planning to do this summer.
Yep, we've got a very good sensitive one. It's got a 100-meter cable. We're going to do laboratory work. We're also going to be setting up at the Darling Center shelters with head tanks with different oxygen levels to see at what oxygen level do lobsters actually avoid going in a shelter. So we've got lots planned. It got a little bit derailed sometime in March, but we're forging on.
Getting back to work in the field.
Right.
And so there's a lot of really interesting questions here to go big for a little bit. One is about ocean acidification. Can you talk a bit, Bob, about how ocean acidification impacts lobsters?
It's really an important story. And, Heather only gave me 25 minutes for my talk. Otherwise, I would have gone into this, of course. But no, ocean acidification is a serious problem. I mean, certainly we knew that the oceans were warming up. Probably 10 or 15 years ago, people started saying, the evil cousin of ocean warming is ocean acidification, especially, given that warmer temperatures, increased respiration. Respiration means more CO2. Carbon dioxide in water forms carbonic acid. That's the nature of some of the local acidification. And of course, our atmosphere is at an all-time, last 20 million year high of carbon dioxide. And that is actually causing the ocean to become more acidic. Different organisms respond to this acidification in very different ways. And, clams and a lot of studies with larvae and sea urchins are affected. Very surprisingly, some work has found lobsters to be remarkably resistant to ocean acidification. Both adult lobsters, this is Justin Reese's work, but also larval lobsters, Jessica Waller's thesis work. When you do a matrix of temperature and pH, it's not that it's no effect, but the temperature effect is greater than the pH effect. But suffice to say that there are multiple stressors, and so there's multiple reasons to be concerned.
There's a couple of questions here from Bo Hoppin at Hurricane Island and also Parker Gansett at Maine Sea Grant about the longer term research trajectory for the lobster fishery and for lobster ecology in the Gulf of Maine. And particularly as we've seen restoration of anadromous fish, right, how that might be influencing the fishery and the ecology. Can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, look, this has got so many different moving parts. I talked about temperature and the fact that predators are gone, but, the diadromous fish, especially alewife, starting with Edwards Dam and river restoration, the data is very clear that when you clear out those dams, the alewife abundances go way up. Karen Wilson and others have been monitoring the alewife abundances in the Penobscot, and it's really going up in a very big way. There's an ecosystem effect that's interesting and has lots of layers to it. I mean, these are suspension feeders, so there's a lot more suspension feeders. What's that doing? I think Rachel Leslie Rasher is doing work on that right now. But also, I mentioned that herring is actually, there's a quota that makes herring really hard to get for lobster bait, and more alewives. Alewives tend to commingle with herring, so that's a plus. There are certainly people interested in whether the increase of alewife are going to be causing increases in cod stocks and other coastal groundfish. So far, there's no evidence that that is the case, but there's lots of people, including people at the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries, Carla Gunther and others are looking at that aspect of it. So again, all I can say is that given that there's so many different moving parts, I think this is, there are room for lots of folks, whether it's the oceanography, the people involved in river restoration and conservation. But I've said this many times, and that is, if I was a betting man about the single biggest beneficiary of alewife restoration, I think it's the seal population. Their seals have been increasing, and Christina Kamen has a paper on this showing this is a huge increase, especially in the North Atlantic. They tend to swallow their prey whole. They like fish that are almost exactly the size of alewife, and so I think they're going to do very well. Recently, we've seen menhaden coming into the coast of Maine, and the menhaden are another that's a highly migratory species coming up from the mid-Atlantic, but seals are certainly eating them, and when the alewives are more abundant, it looks like the menhaden are more abundant. It looks like the eagles spend more time feeding on fish and a little bit less on seabirds, but stay tuned on that. Complicated ecosystem.
So we've talked a lot about the non-human components of the system, lobster being the star here. There's a couple questions from Andy Thomas and Mike Hers about what people are doing. Andy asks if the lobster population is shifting down east, are fishermen and traps also shifting down east? And Mike was also probing on the question of the distribution of trap setting and how that relates to bottom type, and asking whether you are keeping track of the bottom type where traps are deployed in order to look at that zone of attraction question.
Mike's is an easy one. The answer is not yet, but it's something we really like to do. We've got proposals that we've been putting out there to try to get a bigger army. Back in the 90s, we actually did look at trap densities within square kilometer areas, and we can do more of that. The remotely operated vehicle work, which is all going to be geo-referenced, might give us a little bit of a sense of this. It's complicated because the number of traps on the seafloor does not match the number of buoys that you see, depending upon the trawl lines. But the ROV sees these traps. So we should be able to get good records of trap densities. Andy's question again. Heather,
Andy's question was about, I'm sorry, I moved it to the answered.
I know what it is. It's has effort shifted to Eastern Maine? There are constraints on that. Lobstering still is a community-driven occupation. These are relatively small boats. The zones were all set up having about the same number of lobstermen in them when the 7 zones were first set up in 1995. That said, yes, there's been somewhat of an increase. The number of traps per person hasn't gone up, but when the, I hope I don't glaze eyeballs here, but when the zones were first set up in 1995, the idea was we had too many people fishing. So when licenses were retired, you had a certain number of licenses retired before you could go into a lottery and get a new lobsterman. Well, the different zones are able to change that ratio so that rather than causing the number of fishermen to decline, some places that have increased, like Washington and Hancock County, have actually allowed more lobstermen to get into the fishery more rapidly. So there has been a creep upward. I don't exactly know what the numbers are off the top of my head, but it's all on the DMR website.
Thanks, Bob. I think we have time for a couple more questions if you're game.
Yep.
They keep filtering in. One comes from Ohio from Rich Benz, and he asks about warmer water conditions and just the general principle that warmer water often promotes faster growth. Is this something that we're seeing with Maine lobsters?
That's a really good question. And, you know, I don't know anybody who's explicitly looking at that, although Jessica Waller did show with warmer water, lobsters tend to become reproductive at a smaller size. And she has shown a significant shift in reproductive lobsters that are actually smaller than the females carrying eggs, smaller than they were 10, 20 years ago. But Rick Wally did some work some years ago where he compared rates of growth of lobsters in Rhode Island, which is much warmer, to those in Maine. And yes, they grow faster. They get to marketable size faster. So I don't know of anybody who's actually tagged to ask that question, but I'd be very surprised if we don't see the same thing, that they're reaching marketable size faster because of warmer water.
There's another question here about restoration, and particularly in terms of sea urchins. Has sea urchin removal been restricted in Maine waters, and how difficult would it be to restore populations to what they were before?
I mean, for all practical purposes, sea urchin fishery is pretty much absent. There's two zones divided right in Penobscot Bay. You're allowed so many days at sea to fish. The number of days in the western region is just a couple days for the year. It's a little bit more in eastern Maine, where the harvest is still coming in, but it's a fraction of what it once was. I published a paper on this some years ago. I still think it's probably maybe more correct than wrong, and that is that with this increase of seaweed, it was a great nursery habitat for baby crabs. And these baby crabs, we were able to show with experiments, eat the settling sea urchin larvae when they come down. And then these baby crabs become big crabs and they eat sea urchins. And we have laboratory studies showing that. So the crabs, which are pretty darn abundant on the coast of Maine, and the fishery just started up, within the last, 5 or 6 years for them, they are eating the sea urchins. And there have been many attempts to restore bringing sea urchins into areas. None of them have succeeded to date. There hasn't been any ability to restock sea urchins. It's an alternative stable state, we call it.
So some more benthic questions here, bottom habitat questions. Jeremy Rich at UMaine asks if you are still finding the shift towards sediment when you look at the data only from the Boothbay region. I think that maybe it's about shelter or habitat use by adults.
Well, we're seeing that at virtually all the places where we looked. I think that it's most pronounced actually in our area and further to the south. And in part because I think the slightly cooler temperatures in eastern Maine actually has prevented the gorilla hare, the Daisy japonica, from spreading that far. But it is getting into Mount Desert area, so it is doing its thermal creep to the east. I'm hoping I answered your question there.
Can follow up with your face masks on next week, if not. And then a final question here, again from Parker Gassett. With the rise of seaweeds coast-wide, would you expect that the added organic material will increase sediment layers in existing boulder fields?
Well, we certainly do see this rotting goo inside the boulders. What I don't really know is how much is actually accumulating and sequestering. I think that there are a lot of critters, worms, for example, that love to eat this kind of rotting seaweed. Now, what I don't know, and I think it would be, if we can find anoxia in these lobster shelters, it opens up a whole lot of questions like, well, what happens to the organisms? Are they, is this becoming a dead zone, micro dead zones on the coast of Maine? We don't know. This summer, we might be able to answer some of those questions.
Well, we'll stay tuned for more then. You were rapid. We managed to make our through all published questions. I'm sure you'd be happy to entertain additional questions via email if folks want to reach out to you through the Darling Marine Center website. Before I announce the next talk, I just want to thank you again, Bob, for kicking off our series. It was great to have you present. And so our next talk will be on July 24th, also at 10:30 a.m. through this Zoom webinar interface. We'll be hearing from Professor Meg Estapa. Meg is a new faculty member at the University of Maine and has just moved to the Darling Marine Center. And she'll be talking about the links between ocean life, the global carbon cycle, and future climate. So I hope that you'll be able to join us again on July 24th at 10:30, and you can register and get details on that talk. and the last talk in the series on our website, Darling Marine Center at the University of Maine. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you again, Bob.